Welcome to Workers' Comp Update with Joseph Sensale. Joe is a partner in the Chase Sensale Law Group and is also treasurer of the New York Workers' Compensation Alliance, dedicated to serving the needs of injured workers throughout New York State by lobbying their interests in Albany.
Happy New Year, Joe, and let's talk a little bit about the success of the campaign in Albany.
Yes. Happy New Year, Steve. The efforts of the New York Workers' Compensation Alliance has proven successful in as much as the new guidelines that are being implemented to determine permanent impairment for workers' compensation injuries have gone into effect January 1st. And they're not the original version that we so vehemently fought against in September. The version that was implemented was revised in November and then adopted by the Workers' Compensation Board, as I said, effective January 1. So the draconian changes that were proposed in the original guidelines have been abandoned in favor of these newer guidelines, which are absolutely much more reasonable than the original proposal. And again, they went into effect January 1. So the Workers' Compensation Alliance, in challenging the initial proposal, was successful in accomplishing most of our goal in revising the guidelines in a more reasonable manner. So that's good news. I could go into detail about what some of those changes are so that people can become familiar with it. But the codification of the new guidelines can be found at the New York State Workers' Compensation Board's website in what's called subject number 046-1011. And it's simply entitled 2018 Permanent Impairment Guidelines for Scheduled Loss of Use Evaluations. So if anyone is interested in the actual codification of it, they can see it's a very short, what we call subject number, and it does reference the statutory changes that were made and the regulatory changes that were made and where these things can be found. But all in all, it was a successful campaign in as much as that we were able to obtain a reasonable result.
Well, let's dive in here, Joe, and that's great news. But let's get maybe a little more specific about the results of the efforts by the New York Workers' Compensation Alliance with respect to the proposed changes to the permanent impairment guidelines that were sought to be implemented beginning of this year, beginning of 2018. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure, absolutely, Steve. Well, now these regulations have been officially adopted, so that's a good thing. And what basically the changes, the significant revisions involve what we call special considerations. Under the older guidelines, the ones that were sought to be revised, there were certain default figures or percentages of loss of function for joint replacements, like a knee replacement or a hip replacement, a shoulder replacement. For instance, I'll give you an example, like a knee replacement would be worth anywhere between 50 and 55% loss of function just by virtue of the fact that someone had a knee replacement. But now, the original proposed revisions were looking to completely undo that, where we are not certain what the result would have been under those guidelines. But the revised proposal, the one that was adopted, does eliminate that arbitrary, say, 50 to 55%, and replaces it with a baseline of 35%. But on top of that, you could use different factors to augment that. So you can have anywhere between a 35% loss of function and an 80% loss of function, which is actually higher than what the original guidelines actually proposed. But again, it depends on the outcome of that surgery, the knee replacement or shoulder replacement or hip replacement, whatever it may be. We anticipate that most of the loss of function for these type of injuries would be anywhere between 45 and 50%, which is not far afield from what we've already had. So again, not ideal in the sense that you could get a default 55% loss of function for a knee replacement. But now with these different factors, you could wind up with something slightly less, however, something that could be augmented depending on the outcome to well above what the original proposal, the original guidelines rather, called for. There's also an elimination of a couple of things. There's elimination of the default 10 to 15% loss of function for, say, a rotator cuff tear in the shoulder, or a 7.5% loss of function for a meniscal tear in your knee. That doesn't mean you don't get a loss of function. It just means that it's based on the outcome, the resulting outcome in terms of range of motion. So again, the default doesn't exist. However, you can still attain a loss of function assessment regardless of that. So those are some of there are other changes as well regarding how to calculate loss of function to fingers and thumbs and hands, but that gets a little involved. But here, the ones that I pointed out are probably the ones that were most significant and the ones that had most people's attention.
Okay, so let me ask this, Joe. Are there any specific items in the newly adopted guidelines that require special attention?
Well, yeah, other than the items that I had just identified, like I said, with loss of function of a thumb, the normal finding of what's called abduction, which is a form of range of motion, was changed from 90 degrees to 60 degrees. So there was a recognition of that in the new guidelines about the change in what should be a normal range of motion. With respect to the concept called loading, well, you have a multiple finger injury on your hand. The way that's converted into another type of loss of function has been augmented. So those are the kinds of things that people will want to look at when they actually do the calculation about what the loss of function should be. And when I say people, I mean medical experts that are going to be conducting the examinations that are going to be the predicate for the loss of function finding. So those are the things that in specific detail that interested parties should look at, because again, it's slightly different than what the old guidelines had called for, and it's just not. The new guidelines are simply not just a small revision of the older guidelines. There are changes that should be brought to people's attention.
Okay, well that's good to know. Now that the proposed guidelines have been adopted and are in effect, okay, is there anything else on the agenda for your political action committee?
That's a great question, because a lot of people thought that, well, the fight's over. It's not. There is a legislative agenda that we do have for other issues going forward. There's something called the Social Security Presumption Bill. What does that mean? Most people or most injured workers, I should say, that have a permanent disability may qualify for Social Security disability as well, because they can't perform substantial gainful employment. So they could be disabled under the New York workers' compensation rules as well as the Social Security rules, which is a federal benefit. But if Social Security has made the determination, the Social Security Administration has made the determination that somebody cannot perform substantial gainful employment and is essentially totally disabled, then we're arguing that to prevent excessive litigation in the New York compensation system, there should be a presumption that says that the individual or the injured worker is totally disabled in terms of the New York State workers' compensation system. And again, that's a presumption that's rebuttable, meaning that there could be evidence offered to say, no, that really doesn't apply here. But for the most part, if one administrative body has determined that somebody has or an injured worker has a total disability, to avoid litigation and getting a disparate result, perhaps, the presumption would allow that to continue unless it was rebutted with other evidence to say that the person is not totally disabled. So that's one thing that we're pushing for. Again, the goal here is to try to eliminate litigation, make it a more streamlined system, and to eliminate what essentially is friction in the workers' compensation system. So that's one thing. The other thing is something called labor market attachment bill. The issue of labor market attachment is one that most, if not all, of the workers' compensation practitioners in New York are familiar with. What it simply means is that if you have less than a total disability, less than 100% impairment, then the law imposes an obligation for that individual under certain circumstances to seek work within their ability to work. What this does is supposed to qualify what that phrase labor market attachment really means. It was designed for a different purpose than the one that's being currently implemented now, which is essentially to use as a tactic to eliminate benefits to injured workers. So we're looking to redefine that and to make sure that it's used properly as a defense. One of the other things is something called the major schedule loss bill. What that simply means is that when you lose what function of what's called a major member, that's an arm, a leg, a hand, etc. What the major schedule loss bill would do is ensure that an individual with such a loss of function may very well be entitled to benefits well beyond what is the customary limitation on those benefits. So that's another item that we're seeking to have the legislature address. And then two more of significance. And the first one is what's something called protracted healing period bill. Now, with scheduled loss of use, what happens is if somebody is considered totally disabled for an extensive period of time, and that period of time is defined by statute as a number of weeks. If somebody is totally disabled for greater than what's been designated as those number of weeks for each body part, then they would be entitled to an additional benefit on top of whatever the loss of function award would give them. But because there have been improvements in medicine with better outcomes, the amount of weeks that would be required for somebody to be totally disabled and then receive that benefit is kind of archaic. So what we're looking to do is see if we can revise, because these are set forth in statute, we're looking to revise the number of weeks for each body part so that attaining what's called protracted healing period, that is the period of time over and above whatever that number of weeks is to be totally disabled, to reduce them to reflect what's been to reflect the improvements in medicine and in the outcomes that come from better medical practices. There's a couple of other bills that we're interested in addressing with the legislature here in New York. One is the cost of living adjustment bill. Just so people know, there has never been a cost of living adjustment for workers' compensation benefits. And for the longest time, during the 90s, the rate of compensation all the way through 2007 the maximum rate had been $400 a week. And there's never been an adjustment to that. What this bill, one of the things that we're looking to address, is having those benefits subject to that. And there's a good economic benefit to that to all New Yorkers because, again, cost of living increases here in New York, but not does somebody's benefit, and they may be relying on this benefit as their only source of income. And as a result, a lot of injured workers wind up leaving the state because they simply can't afford the change in the cost of living, and as a result, it destroys the economic base anywhere, for me on Long Island, but for anywhere in the state. So this bill would seek to address that and help alleviate that problem. Two other items. One is the minimum rate bill. Right now, the state's maximum rate of compensation is indexed to the state average weekly wage, but the minimum rate is not. And to avoid any kind of disparity in that or resulting in somebody receiving benefits that are well below what it would take to economically survive in New York, this bill would address that so that the state average weekly wage would perhaps be also linked to the minimum rate of compensation that somebody can receive. And the last item is something called the safety net bill. That the safety net is a concept where if somebody's what we call loss of wage earning capacity is excessive, anything over 75%, would allow them to then at some point in the future, or actually the last year that they're entitled to benefits, because right now, if you have a permanent disability, unless you're 100% totally disabled, which entitles you to benefits for the rest of your life, if you have a permanent partial disability, your benefits can, again, I'm oversimplifying it, can range anywhere between 2 and 10 years worth of benefits. If somebody, though, is in that safety net, in their last year of receipt of benefits that's been scheduled, they can make the claim for what we call extreme hardship, to have the Workers' Compensation Board address whether or not somebody is entitled to benefits beyond what has already been scheduled, or what we call the cap. And if if the definition of extreme hardship is legislated, we'll know what an individual needs to, the criteria an individual needs to meet or an injured worker needs to meet in order to make the claim for benefits beyond the permanent partial disability schedule that was already determined. So again, that's something else that we want to address with the legislature. So again, as I was saying earlier, some people may think that the fight is over with respect to any issues in workers' compensation now that the schedule loss guidelines have been implemented. However, there are these other issues that do need to be addressed, and that's what the organization will continue to do throughout 2018 and beyond that, and hopefully carry over with it the success that we've had somewhat in 2017. And in terms of successes for 2017, Steve, one of the other things that was successfully voted down was the state constitutional convention. It was mind-blowing in terms of the votes against. If you factor out the margin of error, you could argue that anywhere between 90 and 95% of New Yorkers did not want a constitutional convention. And again, that preserves all sorts of benefits for people throughout the state, whether they're injured workers or not. It preserves pensions. It preserves obviously workers' compensation rights, as well as a multitude of other things. So again, I'd like to think that myself and my colleagues had some impact on shifting the thoughts on a constitutional convention from what was at one point in September 58% of the voting populace in New York anticipating voting for it, to a 95% majority voting against it. So again, continued success at the legislature, I think, hopefully will be translated into what the Workers' Compensation Alliance will continue to do in the coming year and beyond.
Thanks for listening to Workers' Comp Update with Joseph Sensale. Joe is a partner in the Chase Sensale Law Group and is also treasurer of the New York Workers' Compensation Alliance. Join us next time as Joe keeps us updated with what's going on in Albany.